George Howe was involved in this, taught for many years up at the Master's College. Another one of my mentors, Dr. Howe, is now retired. But pollen grains are found in the Grand Canyon in Cambrian and Precambrian strata. Now let me explain why that's an impossibility if you're an evolutionist. The Precambrian and Cambrian, in particular the Cambrian time period, the border of the Cambrian, if you look at the geologic column, is said to be by evolutionists about 530 million years BP or before present. Okay? Now, flowering plants are said by evolutionists to not have evolved until somewhere around the Cretaceous time period, okay, which is only about 70 million years before present. So well over a 400 million year gap between the Cambrian and when they say that flowering plants first evolved. So if I found evidence of flowering plants in the Cambrian, that would be extremely damaging, okay? So beginning in 1966, if you look at the first bullet there, creationist Dr. Clifford Burdick, and I remember meeting Dr. Burdick. He was, by any standards, old even then, and I was just a young man in my 20s, and it was so wonderful because Dr. Burdick was, in many ways, you know, like an icon to me. So in 1966, creationist Dr. Clifford Burdick began to report on finding pollen grains from the Precambrian Hackatized Shale and other strata in the Grand Canyon, Arizona. At the time, he was a graduate student at University of Arizona, I believe. Evolutionary scientists have believed that early land plants arose from algal forms back in the Silurian, while conifers, those are, you know, the pines are conifers, and flowering plants are not supposed to have debuted until the Permian. So the Silurian and the Permian, and then the Cretaceous for the actual flowering plants. So we're talking many, many millions of years difference in the strata. Okay? So the pollen grains that Burdick found were reddish in color. This is the key point. The same as the strata. Okay? They were the same color as the strata. If pollen grains were the result of contamination, which the evolutionists, if you go to their websites, that's how they'll explain this. They'll say, oh, this is contamination. You see there was wind. The current species of plants simply blew down into the Cambrian and Precambrian strata. This is how it can be explained. Ah, but how did you get it a reddish color, the same color as the strata? So when the strata was deposited, strata is short for stratigraphy, I'm sure most of you know that, then it wouldn't be the same color, okay? If the contamination grains were the result of contamination, the grains would be a clear, colorless, like modern pollen grains, not a reddish color like the strata, which argues strongly that they were deposited at the same time. Many of the pollen samples were unlike any from plants now growing on Grand Canyon walls. You can't just blow it off and say, oh, well, you see the current species of organism, plant material that's growing there. There was simply wind that blew that down into those layers and then deposited them, okay? So this was kind of a mystery for many years following this as I was kind of going through getting my degrees and going through graduate school. And Dr. Arthur Chadwick in the 1980s, who was down at Loma Linda, tried to duplicate Dr. Burdick's work in the Grand Canyon. However, he concluded that the pollen grains must have been from contamination. Well, as it turned out, Chadwick was only able to match about 5 of those 31 different pollen grains that Burdick had published on. What that means is 26 of the pollen grain samples were not like modern samples. So he couldn't account for those. He was trying to do good science. He's actually a creationist, but he came to a different conclusion than Burdick did. Such a find that supports Burdick's claims and casts considerable doubt on the uniformitarian evolution age estimate of billions of years or hundreds of millions of years with the dating of the Hackatized Shale, if Burdick was correct. That was the conclusion of Dr. George Howe back in the 1980s. Many additional examples of out-of-place fossil plants have been reported. For example, micro-vegetable remains from sedimentary rocks in Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Scotland. and these are up to 2 billion years old, published in Science News, but they had to be published anonymously. Why? Because if someone published on that, they would be part of Dr. Jerry Bergman's book. Anybody read that, Slaughter of the Dissidents? If you're a creationist and you publish in, or try to publish in a scientific journal that's not a creationist journal, you will be ostracized and you will lose your job. We've seen it happen time and time again. My good friend who was at Cal State Northridge in the last couple of years, Dr. Mark Armitage, maybe some of you guys know him. Actually, he's Professor Mark Armitage, not a doctor. But he ran the microscopy lab over there, and when he published in a secular journal that he had found soft tissue in a Triceratops horn, he was terminated. And right now, my understanding is that's going through litigation. So this is what happens to creationists that publish things that don't fit evolution. Jerry Bergman's Slaughter of the Dissidents. If you haven't read that book, I highly recommend you read it. Higher order plants have also been reported from strata beneath the Cambrian. Fossil vascular plants, those are plants that have piping, have been found in India and eastern Siberia. Okay, so back to the original study that we're talking about from the 1966 case, keeping in mind that this is not the only case. If you found, you know, a red herring where you found some pollen grains, you might say, well, you know, it hasn't been found in other places, but there are dozens of reports, I just cited a few with our sidebar there, that plants that are out of sequence have been found in numerous other cases. So in 1966, Dr. Walter Lammertz, who was a PhD in botany, the study of plants, and Dr. George Howe showed that the airborne pollen contamination during slide preparation, which they claimed was the case, was shown to be extremely low. They did some studies on this that showed that you could rule out contamination. So these workers felt that Dr. Chadwick, who was a creationist and didn't agree, conclusion was not supporting contamination during the preparation of these slides. More so, Dr. Howe et al., that means other workers with him, reported that Chadwick had used a particular different procedure involving hydrofluoric acid to extract the pollen grains. Well, the problem that they discovered, if you use hydrofluoric acid, you also destroy the pollen grains. So Chadwick's work has to be discounted, and you know, it isn't valid because he destroyed the pollen grains, so you're not going to get the kind of examples that Burdick had gotten. It's now known that hydrofluoric acid may have caused the negative results. That's pretty strongly established. So Howe et al. Back in 1988 confirmed Dr. Burdick's original work from '66. They found the following objects from samples of that Hecate shale: pine pollen, angiosperms, that's flowering plants, okay, that supposedly didn't evolve until the Cretaceous. You go from 530 million years to 70 million years, 400 million year gap, before flowering plants should have evolved. But they found good, solid samples. They dug into the strata to show that these were not contaminated samples, and then they very carefully collected them. I interviewed Dr. Howe on this with great detail, and he confirmed, and I know Dr. Howe, he's a thoroughgoing scientist with a PhD in botany and knows what he's doing. So they found a number of these out-of-sequence pollen grains that document this case is a valid case. We find solid examples that flowering plants and other types of plants that shouldn't have existed for many, many millions of years in Cambrian strata. Now this is unimportant, but I just wanted you to see the documentation on this from numerous other non-creationist articles that confirm. Look at this. Leclerc, back in 1956, evidence of vascular plants. Those are plants that have piping, okay? So they're not just some little primitive type plant. These are vascular plants. Were found back in 1956. Look at this, 1945, 1944. So numerous other scientists have reported the evidence of plants out of sequence. So nobody can say, oh, well, this is just contamination, you see. Dr. Howe and the others, they're just these lunatic fringe creationists that don't know what they're talking about. This is an airtight case that we find fossils out of sequence. So Mr. Bill Nye, science guy, there are out-of-sequence fossils, guy. Okay, so here's an example of the Grand Canyon and what a pollen grain looks like. And this is not necessarily a pollen grain that Dr. Howe worked with, but I just wanted you to see what a pollen grain looks like. And of course, everybody knows what the Grand Canyon looks like. Okay, so another out-of-sequence fossil example, and I'm only going to document about 7 or 8 of these. As I mentioned, if I find one valid out-of-sequence fossil, it destroys the whole case that there are no out-of-sequence fossils. But I'll document 7 or 8. I've already referred you to the book Forbidden Archaeology, where Thompson and Cremo published in the 1990s, and they published hundreds of out-of-sequence fossils. So anybody that would like to look at that book can look at it, and they're not Christians or creationists. Example 2, a dinosaur in a mammal's stomach. How shocking. After all,
Wow.
I'm sorry, did you say something?
No, I said wow.
You were chuckling.
Yeah.
A dinosaur in a mammal's stomach. And you know about this, Jeremy. In 2005, it was reported that a fossil mammal was found. It's like, okay, so what? Well, the fossil mammal found in the Liaoning province in China, dated by evolutionary standards. You understand, I don't believe in these dates. I am a young Earth creationist. I think we can prove as much as possible that the Earth is young. Particularly with the recent discovery of over 30 examples of ancient fossils, many of them dinosaurs, that show strongly of soft tissue found with their remains. Their soft tissue cannot survive 70 million years. That's an impossibility. The evolutionists admit this. Mary Schweitzer, who was the original founder of these dinosaur remains with soft tissue, acknowledges that. And there's even evidence of DNA that it had to have degraded in the 70 million years they claim since dinosaurs were alive. So their case is extremely weak for an old Earth in that regard. The fossil mammal found in Liaoning province, China, dated to about 130 million years BP, that means before present. It had a fossil dinosaur in its stomach. It was found in the Cretaceous Strata. The fossil in the mammal stomach was a juvenile Sitkasaur, okay, a Sitkasaurus. It's a dinosaur that has a beak in it, and that's where the name comes from. Saurus means, lizard, and Sitkasaur, the Sitko part, is a parrot-like dinosaur. The mammal was given the name Rhipinomamus robustus, and a second mammal twice that size was also actually found. Okay? Example 2 continues. This challenges the conventional idea that mammals during the Mesozoic were these small, kind of little scurrying, nocturnal, only come out at night type creatures, and live in the shadows of dinosaurs. Okay? This is supposed to be the age of the reptile. And yet almost all of the plants and animals we recognize today were alive at the same time as the dinosaurs. Okay, and there's the documentation of the article that was published in Nature on that. Many of you read Acts and Facts and are familiar with creation scientist Brian Thomas. What he said about this, it's kind of interesting. He says, he's pointed out that the evidence contradicts the conventional evolutionary type theory. It's not what you would be expecting to find. This theory suggests that early mammals couldn't attack and eat a dinosaur because mammals were these little teeny scurrying, they were afraid of these big lumbering behemoths that would come out, and they would hide until, then as the theory goes, there was an asteroid that hit planet Earth and all the dinosaurs were wiped out, and then that led to the evolution of the mammals, supposedly. But if that's true, what in the world is a fossil mammal? I'm going to show you what it looks like right now. It looks like a modern-day creature, by the way. What is it doing eating a dinosaur? I thought they were these little scurrying critters that hid in the bushes. They were afraid of the dinosaurs. But here he is tracking and eating a dinosaur found fossilized in its stomach. Say this theory suggests early mammals could not attack and eat dinosaurs because mammals were these timid, small, and they scurried in the shadow of these giant lumbering reptile dinosaurs, which they were supposedly afraid of. Oh, really? Well, one had, a dinosaur for breakfast, so that doesn't quite fit. Okay? The mammal appears strongly to be related to the critter that we know from Southeast Asia called a Tasmanian devil. The body's length is about the same size as the large Tasmanian devil. It has the same unique skeleton features of a marsupial. For example, the tear duct holes in their skulls are located on the edge of the eye socket. These are kind of technical statements, so don't worry if you're not precisely understanding them. Marsupials have a pair of bones that extend from their pelvis towards their head. These epipubic bones support marsupial pouches in some species. There are some differences, though, but they're minor, between the fossils and modern Tasmanian devils. But they're minor can be explained as variation of a kind. We know that, for example, all creatures that live in different environments and so forth eat different diets. They're the same general taxonomic kind, probably at the family level or the genus level, but they can look a little bit different in different environments. Okay? The conclusion is this is a Tasmanian devil, but since mammals of this kind could not have, quote, evolved this early, a different genus and species name are given to the specimen. So this is what evolutionists do. It's kind of a bait and switch. They'll take a creature that's almost identical to modern creatures, but if it lived at a certain time and is found with, you know, an index fossil like a dinosaur, oh, well then it can't be a Tasmanian devil because they didn't live during that time. Everybody knows that. Well, how do you know that? Excuse me, how do you know that? Oh, because evolution's a fact. And so it can't be a Tasmanian devil because Tasmanian devils didn't evolve. This is what the evolutionists would say. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. Here we see at the top, oh, and I don't have a pointer stick, sorry, so I'm going to point. I know that's supposed to be rude, but I'm going to point. The fossil, here you see a fossil modern Tasmanian devil, and here's a reconstructed drawing. Now just imagine if those are the same color, how similar the creatures are. And there he is with the dinosaur in his mouth. Very, very much like a modern day Tasmanian devil. And this is only the tip of the iceberg, folks. Now, I've given two examples. Those two, if I found nothing else, would be serious damage for an evolutionist. But they might just say, well, you know, this is a red herring. You've got one or two examples, okay, but, you know, the overall, all the evidence supports that evolution's a fact. No, I don't think so. Not only do we find a lack of transitional forms, stasis in the fossil record, a lack of these intermediates, but we find many examples of out-of-sequence fossils that are appearing in the wrong layers of strata. Okay? Let's give example number 3 of out-of-sequence fossils. This was published in Acts and Facts, ICR's publication. Recently, 6 squirrel-like fossils have been found in the same strata as dinosaurs. These were found in China, promptly named, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that because it's almost an unpronounceable word. These were found in China. Creationists have pointed out the scientific name merely cloaks or covers the plain old squirrels that were found in Jurassic layers. They often do this. If it's a creature that is found in the wrong sequence, they throw off anybody that wonders, well, what's a squirrel doing in strata that it shouldn't appear in? So they merely give it a different taxonomic name. Nobody's the wiser because almost all paleontologists, with the exception of myself and Jeremy and a few others, Kurt Wise, are evolutionists. So they can get away with that. They simply, it's a bait and switch, they change the name, but you can't change what the fossils actually show. Creationists pointed out that the scientific name merely cloaks that covering. Plain old squirrels found in Jurassic strata. Okay, the time of the dinosaurs. What's a squirrel doing in that time if mammals evolved from reptiles? It shouldn't be there. Other swamp-friendly mammals have also been recently found, including shrews, beavers, raccoon-sized tracks, and rodents. Conclusion, and it's an important one, most mammals probably did not live in the same ecological zone that dinosaurs did. That's why you don't see, you know, lots of examples of dinosaurs and modern mammals. They lived in different environments. The same reason why if we were buried in this room, fortunately we won't be, but if we were all buried in this room and someone said, well, you know, how do I know whales lived at the same time as the people in this room? We don't find any whales mixed with them because whales live in a totally different ecological environment. The ecological zone in argument holds very true in many cases. It may not be the total answer, but it explains a lot of things that we find. Okay? So many creatures just didn't live in swamp areas. That's why they wouldn't be found fossilized in swamp areas. But there's the Acts and Facts article. If you subscribe to Acts and Facts, you can look at the January 2015 page 16 article and find some of this evidence. Okay, so if we look at these then, fossils found resembling modern squirrel and groundhog-like mammals, and you see the fossil in the upper right-hand corner there, and it has the same general anatomy as these rodents that are alive today. But evolutionists would never admit that or publish that because that's damaging evidence to evolution. Okay, so that's 3 examples now. Let me move on to example number 4. Again, I'm only going to cite about 7 or 8 examples because you'll all fall asleep if I continue. But I want to go beyond 1 or 2. You understand why, because I don't want someone being able to argue this is just a red herring, especially Bill Nye. Example number 4, the Napa doll. Okay, the Napa doll was found in 1889 in Nampa, Idaho, during a well drilling operation to try to locate an artesian well. Okay, they didn't have sparklets in those days, and so they needed to drill a well and find some fresh water. What was found was actually a very small clay figurine, but this is so damaging. Think of that case that I mentioned, the cave where Taylor had found, the character Taylor played by Charlton Heston, had found that little baby. Just the one word that baby said refuted the whole concept that the apes were the higher order and had come first and all that. Okay, it was found at a depth at about 350 feet, so it was really found deep. And knowing about the flood, I would predict that makes a lot of sense because the civilization that existed at the time of the flood would be completely obliterated and buried at great depths if it was preserved at all. The rest of it would be completely destroyed. But notice this 350 feet by an artesian well sand pump, a sand pump that pumps the sand out to get down to the water table, which was in that particular case very, very deep. So this doll, which I'm going to show you pictures of in just a minute, is only approximately 1.5 inches tall. This thing is tiny. Keep that in mind. That 1.5 inches will be essential to refuting the people that said this didn't really come out of that hole. Clay balls, this is another important point, up to 2 inches in size came up through that pump prior to the figurine. So there had been objects bigger that came up through the sand pump than the doll. That's a very important point to those that want to refute that this is a true original object of great antiquity. Okay, so there was a professor, F.W. Putnam, who was from Harvard University, who found quartz grains underneath the doll's right arm through microscopic analysis and had been cemented by iron molecules. Now, if that's the case, this is very strong evidence because it suggests that this wasn't just some little doll that was cooked up in somebody's, kiln and then presented as being an ancient artifact, because it actually had microscopic quartz particles that showed it was from the original sand pit. Okay, the figurine was deeply colored with iron oxides characteristic of deposit from that 300 feet. The strata at the depth is dated, according to evolutionists, now I don't accept this date, but according to evolutionists, at 2 million years before present. Okay? Now there's a number of objections by evolutionists. Of course they're going to try to refute this because that one little teeny doll, which I will show you pictures of in just a minute, destroys the whole idea of human evolution, that man evolves from an ape-like ancestor and through the process of millions of years develops primitive tools and then eventually becomes, modern man through a process of evolution. So there's a number of objections. Number one, that's got to be a hoax. Why? How do you know that? Well, because evolution, according to the evolutionists, is a fact, and we are the learned scholars. We are the enlightened ones. That's what the evolutionists teach. All my education, by the way, is from evolutionists, not creationists, but I still don't believe what they say. The evidence is overwhelming against evolution. They say it's a hoax because evolution is a fact. It couldn't survive the excavation, is what they said. They said, look, come on, that sand pump, that thing really, sucks things out with great velocity, and it would destroy any kind of a doll coming up through that. Come on, you couldn't get a doll up through there, and it wouldn't survive. The age is actually late tertiary or early quaternary. The strata is actually too ancient to contain human artifacts. Come on, evolution is a fact. It just can't be. That's what we're told. Another possibility, they say, oh, this was just carved by modern, recent Native American Indians. And somehow maybe it just fell into the pit, you see, and maybe it went down instead of coming up. Okay, now let's go through and absolutely refute these problems that they're stating. Number one, there's no evidence of local Native Indians carving these type of artifacts in this area. There's nothing that shows a similar type of carving by Native American Indians for the Nampa doll. It did survive excavation. However, based on its condition, it did become damaged. You're going to see the doll. Yeah, they're right that when it came up through that pump, it got, tore up. But when you look at it, you see that it got tore up as it was sucked up through the pump. Due to evolution being a, quote, fact, it's not been accepted among evolutionary scientists. So that's why it hasn't been more furtherly published, why it hasn't been accepted. Why? Because, quote, again, I keep saying it over and over, but I'm telling you it's true. Evolution is a fact, and therefore it cannot be. So they have their mind made up before they look at the evidence. The age was determined by the level of the strata, according to evolutionary theory. This level of strata shows it to be 2 million years old, well before this kind of life could have evolved, so it can't be, because we, the intelligentsia, the enlightened ones, will tell you, the people, how to think. Okay, that's the way they teach, and that's the way they tell you. Okay, if you've read a book by Richard Dawkins, could be any of his books, you know that what I'm saying is correct. The people involved were always described as citizens of stature in the community. They weren't a bunch of hoaxers. What they had to say was true. They weren't the kind of people that made stories up. So this artifact is not a hoax, and that was determined by Professor Robert Gent from the Creation Research Society, who published an article after investigating this in great detail, going back through the records and looking what people had to say. He believed very strongly, although I admit he's biased, he's one of those lunatic French creationists like you and I, that said, look, I don't see any evidence not only of it being a hoax, but of it not being accurately true. So there's what the Nampa doll actually looks like. Now notice how torn up this thing is. Yeah, it did survive coming up through that sand pump, but look at how it got tore up. It's supposed to be a female doll, obviously human-made, and obviously of great antiquity. You don't see this kind of doll made by Native American Indians at all. So in my opinion, it is a true out-of-sequence fossil. So there are out-of-sequence fossils, Bill Nye. There are out-of-sequence fossils, Guy. Okay, let's go to the next example, example number 5. The Lidoli or Latoli footprints. I've heard it pronounced both ways. My professor at Cal State Northridge, Dr. Bruce Galvin, pointed out that it could be pronounced either way. Starting in 1976, Mary Leakey, one of the famous Leakey family, there was Richard Leakey, Louis Leakey was the father of Richard, there's Mev Leakey, and Mary Leakey was the mother. So they've dug in Auldaney Gorge and other places over there in Africa for many, many years. Louis has passed on, so has Mary. Richard's still alive, and Mev is still alive. Starting in 1966, Mary Leakey and associates discovered a series of footprints trails at Site G in a place called Latoli, about 30 miles south of Auldaney Gorge, Tanzania. Now, the Leakeys published in National Geographic extensively over the last 50 years, always, of course, promoting evolution so they could get their grants. The greatest and easiest way to become, a superstar evolutionist is to find a fossil and say, this changes everything. In fact, almost every fossil they find, they'll say, this changes everything. We now know what we didn't know. Well, how come you didn't know if evolution is such a fact, But they didn't. They don't, okay? The site is estimated to be between 3.7 million years before present by evolutionary standards. And there are about 3 trails. There's 3 main trails made by 3 different individuals. The trails contain about 69 prints across approximately 30 yards. Everyone, both evolutionists and creationists, agree that the footprints are strikingly like those made by modern man. So the evolutionists, they don't dispute it. When they look at these prints, they've acknowledged, and I have a number of quotes to document this in case anybody wants to challenge me, that these footprints look only 0.7 million years older than almost all of the hominids that are supposed to be allegedly giving rise to modern humans. Okay, the footprints at Antelope appear to have been made by individuals who were barefoot, as many ancient peoples did walk around barefoot. In spite of the human appearance, evolutionists have ascribed them to creatures like Lucy, Lucy-type hominid, Australopithecus afarensis. Russell Tuttle, who's done more research on this, when I was at graduate school, I read a paper by him, and it's like, wow, do you realize what you're saying? From an evolutionary standard, it's like blasphemy. Russell Tuttle, who is, I think he's still there, a professor at the University of Chicago, and an evolutionist, has stated, quote, "Indiscernible features of the Antelope G prints are indistinguishable from those of habitually barefoot Homo sapiens." End of story. I don't even need to continue on with the lecture. I can close this up and walk out of here right now. I've proven my case. Here is a professional evolutionist who admits in print that these prints at 3.7 million years are indistinguishable from modern Homo sapiens. Destroys their entire case. Tuttle points out that A. afarensis could not have made, in other words, Lucy, could not have made the tracks because of the digital curvature and elongation that is evidence of arboreal, that's swinging through trees, living in trees, of the Australopithecines during that time. These are the only hominids, with few exceptions, that were around during that time. So Tuttle has a real dilemma. He's being honest here. He's a scientist, and sometimes they'll slip up, and instead of thinking like an evolutionist, they'll think like a true scientist. That's what Tuttle did. And so it's a very damaging case, Mr. Bill Nye. We do find out a sequence fossils guy. Okay, so since the tracks are so old, about 3+ million years by evolution standards, again, we don't accept that date, but I'm going by their dates to prove my case. Evolutionists think they're made by an unknown hominid. Yeah, I'll say it's unknown because you don't want to admit that it could be made by humans. Because, quote, everyone knows that humans hadn't evolved at that time. So if you're an evolutionist, you automatically rule out the possibility that it's human fossils. Now, this happens case after case after case. That's why I would like some of you that find this interesting to look at forbidden archaeology, where it's not just one of us lunatic fringe creationists. These are non-creationists, Thompson and Primo, that document hundreds of cases of these out-of-sequence fossils. Okay? So conclusion, this is a perfect example of an out-of-sequence fossil. If one is an evolutionist, it's obvious to see that humans existed during this time period. This is doing better science. Why? Because you're allowing the evidence to speak for itself. If I find a human footprints, I'm not going to attribute it to an ape man. Why should I do that? It's because if my presupposition is evolution as a fact, I'm not going to be able to do good science. I'm not going to be able to come to the right conclusion. So Russell Tuttle admits that this is a human footprint, but he can't bring himself to say that humans were alive at that time because, quote, everybody knows that humans didn't exist at 3.7 million. Oh, really? I've got footprints to show that they did. So when are they going to wake up? Probably never, unfortunately. And I mean, it is unfortunate because I believe strongly that the Lord is very sad whenever somebody doesn't get to come into His kingdom. And as we all know, nobody that doesn't want to be there, that pushes God away, they're not going to be in heaven. He's not going to force them because He's a true gentleman. He's not going to make somebody be in heaven with Him. Why would you not want to be in heaven with Him? here's the God that was so sacrificial he was willing to become a man and die for us. Did Buddha do that? Did Muhammad? Did Confucius? No, only Christ did that, the real and true God. Okay, so here's an example of what these footprints look like. Look at this. Do you have a pencil I could borrow? Does somebody have a pencil? I'm going to use it as a pointer so I'm not so rude, right? Because it's supposed to be rude to point with your hand. So here's the actual footprints. If they were from an ape-like ancestor, they should look like this, okay? The big toe should be divergent, and they should be curved because that's what the ape-like ancestors all look like. If you reconstruct their digits, and they need those kind of digits, they need not just hands, but feet that are grasping so they can grasp in the trees. And if you look at great apes like chimps, gorillas, in the trees they can grasp as good with their feet as they can with their hands. Well, humans, of course, do not have grasping feet. We don't have divergent big toes. And so it's really fascinating. Here's the National Geographic article, which is really a piece of propaganda because look at this. You see a giraffe who had made prints in the sediments there. So what do you put in pictures with the giraffe prints? You put a giraffe. You see birds that had made prints in the strata. So what do you put with the bird prints? Birds. When the human footprints, which Russell Tuttle, you read the quote, when the human footprints are put there, what do the evolutionists put? An ape-like ancestor that is walking in the human footprints. So it's propaganda. The best evidence says that those footprints are made by human beings, and Russell Tuttle, a professional paleoanthropologist, acknowledges that, and so does Mary Leakey, by the way. But since humans, quote, were not alive during that time, we can't acknowledge that humans made those prints. So this is an astounding case. You see the case I'm building, that these evolutionists do not publish the data based on observable science or scientific fact. They publish their conclusions based on the assumption that evolution is a fact before they even look at the evidence. Yes?
Could you go back? Which of the trails are the human footprints? Could you point to those carefully with the pencil?
Well, that's difficult to do. There's 3 sets of prints there, and this shot doesn't reflect them very clearly, but you see a left-right sequence here, right there, right there, right there, left-right sequence. And this is a juvenile sequence up here, okay? So that's not a good set of clear pictures, but you can go on the internet and just Google it, and you'll be able to just put the Litoli footprints, Lidolite footprints, and you'll get clear pictures that you can see better than that. So that wasn't originally intended to show the clarity of the prints. But if I go back here, this is more clear. Here you see the footprints, using a different system that shows you how similar. And the reason that it's not more clear is, of course, there's been some erosion of the prints through time. But it's clear enough to say those are human prints. And the evolutionists agree with us. They just say, okay, yeah, they look exactly like human prints, so it must have been made by some unknown hominid. Well, there's no hominid, with the exception of modern humans, Homo sapiens, that could make prints like that. They've never been found. So you can't conclude that that's the case. That's arguing from a lack of evidence rather than the evidence itself. Okay, let's go on to example number 6. As I mentioned, I'll only do 8 of these, and then I want to pick up some of the quotes from Bill Nye from his book and from the debate and show you how wrong he is about certain things. Example number 6, Pithecanthropus 1, better known as one of the Homo erectus specimens, commonly called Java Man. And I always say when I talk about Java Man, he probably made a mean cup of coffee. Okay? The first Homo erectus, this was found by Eugene Dubois back at the turn of the century, turn of about the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Dubois, who was a student of another man you'll be familiar with, Dr. Ernst Haeckel, he's the one that did the phony embryological drawings, which he was actually kicked out of the university, put on trial and kicked out of the university for forging those embryological drawings, which he said, the famous statement, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That is, the embryos go through an evolutionary stage as they develop in the womb. Well, as it turned out, they were forced, and he took pictures from different kinds of creatures and used them all for the same different species to say that they all evolved through the same stages. Well, it turns out those were complete hoaxes, and if you look at modern day books that we have, you know that those drawings were completely inaccurate, okay? And we know that that's not the case, that each species goes through developmental stages that are not the recapitulation of its evolutionary ancestors. So that's been refuted over and over again. And so in this particular case, though, Eugene Dubois, believing that there was an ape-like ancestors, went over to the Southeast Asia, Java, and began to look for fossils. He used a whole chain gang of convicts to be able to do this. And he found in 2 different locations, a year apart in time, what we see in the diagram. Oh, thank you. What we see here is a femur bone, that's your upper thigh bone, and the top of a skull cap, okay? And he said that he had found the good evidence for an intermediate form. Pithecanthropus erectus is what he called it, upright ape man. And for many years, and in fact this is still in the textbooks as our evolutionary ancestors. Well, the first thing is, creationists knew there was something deeply wrong because the femur bone and the skull cap do in no way articulate. In other words, the bones don't attach in any way. So how would you ever know that they went together? Well, now, in recent times, we've suspected for the last 30 or 40 years that this is the case, that these bones do not go together. Updated evidence through what's called computer tomography by this particular, here's the reference right here, from the Journal of Human Evolution, documented that this femur bone does not go with the skull cap, and that this femur bone is from a modern human being, okay? It is not an evolutionary ancestor. So it's really interesting because they date these particular fossils at somewhere between 600,000 and 900,000 years before present. Well, as soon as they realized that this femur bone is a modern human femur bone and not related to human evolution, they downgraded the date on this to about 100,000 years before present. What was that based on? Well, it's not related to evolution, so it must be younger, you see. Not any kind of radiometric dating or stratigraphy was done. It simply was shown to be a modern human femur bone, not related to the skull cap. And so now we've downgraded its age based on the fact that it isn't related to our earliest ancestors. Isn't that amazing how easy they can change those dates? So this transitional form, which has been in the textbooks for well over 100 years, is now completely unaccepted as an intermediate form. But beyond that, the femur bone documents that modern humans were there at the same time as the ape-like ancestors. Yet another case, this is case number 6, example number 6, of an out-of-sequence fossil. We find a modern human femur bone at the same time as this alleged evolutionary ancestor. Okay, example number 7, the canopoi humerus. Okay, the humerus is your upper arm bone. Okay, there's nothing funny about it, so it's not very humorous. So this is designated KNM KP271. The KNM is Kenyan National Museums, and that's the particular fossil designated number right here you see up at the top. Okay, and so it consists of the end, the bottom end of the left upper arm, the humerus. So the bottom end would be like right down here, right above where your elbow is, okay? And that's the distal end of the humerus, okay? It was discovered in northern Kenya back in 1965 by a man named Brian Patterson. It's aged by evolutionary methods between 3.5 and 4.5 million years. Again, we don't accept these dates, but that's their dating system that they're calling at that age. Patterson and his colleague Howells, that's his last name, used computer discrimination analysis to compare this specimen with the humeri of modern humans, chimps, and Australopithecines. Computer discrimination means they look at the measurements of, in this case, the lower end or distal end of the humerus, and they compare that particular bone, because that's all they had, with these other specimens to see how it matches up. In their publication, they stated, in these diagnostic measurements, Canopoi hominid 1, the distal end of a humerus, is strikingly close to the mean of the human sample. This was published in Science in 1967. Now, Marvin Lubenow looked at this, and he's written a number of books on human artifacts. His latest book, it was published in 2004, called Bones of Contention. To answer the question of the identity of KNM, Kenya National Museum, Canopoi 271, that's the designated number, Patterson and Howes, back in their 1957 paper, used the method of computer discrimination analysis. They compared the KNM KP271 with the distal ends, that's the lower end of the humeri of modern humans, a chimpanzee, and the only other similar fossil they had at the time, the Australopithecines. And at that time it was given the scientific name Paranthropus robustus, but now it's called Australopithecus robustus, from Camaraderie, South Africa. 7 different measurements from each of the 4 samples were fed into the computer. Patterson and House published their results of their study in 1967. Again, the humerus was close to the mean of Homo sapiens. Wait a minute, let's go back a second. This was a fossil that's 3.5 to 4.5 million years old, older than most of the most ancient of the Australopithecines. And what does the computer analysis show? It shows that the humerus was close to the means of Homo sapiens. Whoops, I guess there are out-of-sequence fossils, Bill Nye, the science guy. And this is yet another example. It's older than the oldest of the alleged ape-like ancestors that supposedly document human evolution. Now, here's what's interesting. It was first subsumed, which means put into the taxonomic group, Australopithecus africanus, and then later on put into a different group of Australopithecines, both the same genus name, Australopithecus anamensis by evolutionists. But why? It is human, but all comparisons. The humeri fragment from Canopoi with a date of about 4.4 million years could not be distinguished from Homo sapiens morphology or by multivariate analysis by Patterson, an evolutionist, and the word myself there is for Howes in 1967, or by much more serious searching analysis by others since then. We suggested that it might represent an Australopithecus because at that time allocation to Homo human seemed preposterous. Why? Because evolution is, quote, a fact, although it would be correct without the time element. So Howes admits that they find a human humerus, but he can't bring himself to call it human because, after all, evolution is a fact, and you cannot have a human humerus at that date. So it must be something else. So what do? They put it into a totally different taxonomic group that it has nothing to do with Australopithecus anamensis, because evolution is, after all, a fact, and therefore it can't be human. We can rule that out because we know that evolution is a fact. Well, why do all these fossils in the wrong sequence keep popping up? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how many you find. Evolution must be, according to them, a fact, and therefore we will simply subsume it into other taxonomic groups, and we will not accept the possibility that this is designed and that humans have been there. Okay, so if we're looking at the femur on the right, there's the fossil sample. It is the lower end. This is highlighting the upper end, but that's a mistake. It's actually this lower end of the humerus bone here, and it is identically indistinguishable from modern Homo sapiens humeri. Just all I need is one example. I've given 7 of out-of-sequence fossils. So Bill Nye, there are out-of-sequence fossils, guy. Okay, example number 8, my last example. Sorry for being so verbose on this, but I had to document a number of cases so that you understand it's not a red herring. It's not just, some aberration. It really is the case where we find, and I'm being doing that, you'll fall asleep. Example number 8, the Cambrian explosion. Now this is something that was on, anybody watch the John Ankerberg show? Recently on John Ankerberg, I highly recommend you watch it. It's on Sunday afternoons. He's a Christian apologetics, and you can get his show on many of the Christian channels. And if you can't get it there, just go to his website. Just Google John Ankerberg and you'll get his website. And he's got many of his presentations. Well, Dr. Stephen Mayer has written a recent book. He's written 2 fantastic books that I highly recommend you read if you're interested in this. One, he's the guy that wrote Signature in the Cell. Who's read that? Anybody seen that or heard of it? Okay, good. So, thank you. Okay. One person's heard of it. Signature in the Cell, which documents the case for DNA. DNA is an absolute case with the 3 billion characteristics. It documents the case that there must be a creator because there is a code of 3 billion individual characteristics in the human genome that is precisely ordered. You cannot get a code without a code maker. And Stephen Mayer documents in his book, Signature in the Cell, the code maker is none other than God, who's created. And all living things have DNA codes with billions of individual characteristics in precise order. That cannot be from natural selection because, after all, before living things existed, you can't select for survival of the fittest if there's nothing alive. So how do you do that? You can't. So how, by any kind of understanding, was DNA arranged into the current state? What is the origin of that information content, Mr. Bill Nye? Please explain that to us. We have an answer, but you don't. Okay, let's look at example number 8, the Cambrian explosion. So Stephen Mayer wrote another book on this Cambrian explosion. That's why I brought up his name. And that book is called Darwin's Doubt. In Darwin's Doubt, he documents the Cambrian explosion, which is highly devastating to the theory of evolution. Why? Because it shows that the fossils are in the exact opposite order that Darwin predicted with his tree of life. Complex animals are thought to have occurred about 530 million years before present. The explosion is the abrupt appearance of these body plans that most animals show their phyla of in the Cambrian explosion. The most famous of the strata discovered is the Burgess Shale, which is up in Canada. We find organisms such as trilobites, marilla, worms, opalbenia, Wywaxia, hallucigenia, Anomalocaris. These are all the genus names. Now known worldwide, such as in China, in the Zhejiang fossils, there's dozens of phyla known from this time period. Darwin had argued for a tree-like development of life from a single branch, and then this gave rise to many branches of life, common descent by natural selection. So things would evolve through generations, survival of the fittest. The most fit organisms would live to, have their progeny or their offsprings, and those that weren't fit would die off. And so this is how evolution would proceed. Wrong. The opposite appears in the Cambrian, and Dr. Mayer, who is a scientist, Dr. Stephen Meyer, I should say, has a 500-page book called Darwin's Doubt, where he documents the exact opposite has occurred. The most complex organisms appear first. Get that? Let me say that again. That's important. The most complex organisms appear first in the Cambrian explosion, okay, with no transitional forms. All of the main body plans are found in the Cambrian strata. Darwin simply explained this by the poverty of the fossil record. You see, it was Walcott, one of the men that actually found the first location of the Cambrian strata up in the Burgess Shale in Canada, attributed this mystery of the Burgess Shale to the poverty of the fossil record. And that Darwin said the same thing. He said, well, we don't find these intermediate forms because, they just aren't preserved well in the fossil record. So if we keep digging, we'll find them, okay? The problem is we've been digging for well over 150 years, and we don't find those intermediate forms. When is it good enough? We have 250,000 fossil species in our museums, but we don't have even one good example of an intermediate form. If one goes back to the previous time period, the Precambrian, what is found in the Ediacaran, that's the time period before the Cambrian, the fossils have no relationship whatsoever to the Cambrian fossils. So you can't say, oh, they must have just evolved and that gave rise to them. One will find animals with spinal cords and compound eyes and many other complex structures. The organisms appear suddenly. A quantum jump of multicellular organisms suddenly appearing in the fossil record. Well, if that doesn't sound like creation, I don't know what does. This could not have happened by any stretch of the imagination through evolution. Darwin predicted a branching pattern or bottom up of simple to complex organisms, the tree of life, so to speak. I'll show you pictures in just a minute. However, what we see is top down. Complex organisms appear suddenly. A good example of this is seen in a car. The basic body plan started out first. It didn't evolve into that first car. And then variations appear from that first car. And that's what we see in the fossil record. Even a bigger mystery is how there's one of the typos. I finally found it. Sorry about that. Even a bigger mystery is in the Precambrian, changes occurred from organisms like sponges to complex organisms like trilobites by natural selection and mutation. Supposedly that's how it happened. But Doug Axe, who is a creationist, has pointed out that you can't create functional proteins that fast. Where do the information content, that the DNA that creates the proteins, come from so suddenly? The Cambrian explosion, even by evolutionists, has been called the Cambrian explosion because the organisms appear almost instantaneously in the fossil record. What we see in the fossil record is a hierarchical arrangement in time. Higher levels first, and then variations of these main body plans or systems. A top-down, not a bottom-up, the exact opposite of what Darwin would predict. Conclusion, I'm quoting from Stephen Mayer in his book, Darwin's Doubt. Just listen, don't try to get all this because it's just overwhelming. But over the years, as a paleontologist, have reflected on the overall pattern of the Precambrian Cambrian fossil record in light of Walcott's discoveries. Don't forget, Walcott was the first one that's discovered the Burgess Shale Cambrian explosion fossils in Canada. They have noted that several features of the Cambrian explosion that are unexpected from a Darwinian point of view. So it's the opposite of what Darwin would have predicted. The sudden appearance of Cambrian animal forms, number one. Number two, an abundance of transitional intermediate fossils connecting the Cambrian animals to simple Precambrian forms. There's an absence of those. There aren't any that show that. A startling array of completely novel animal forms with novel body plans. When the first ones appear, they're very complex, just as if designed, not evolved. Number four, a pattern in which radical differences in form in the fossil record arise before minor, small-scale diversification and variations occur. This pattern turns on its head the Darwinian expectation of small incremental changes. Remember, Richard Dawkins wrote a book on that called Climbing Mount Improbable. He said the way it happens is slow, gradual change by natural selection. I don't think so. And I don't think so for you either, Mr. Bill Nye, the science guy, because here is a case of an out-of-sequence fossil where we find far more complex organisms appearing first, and then the minor variational differences occurring in the Cambrian. And Dr. Stephen Mayer has documented that in Darwin's Doubts. Okay, now what we actually find, look at this diagram here, shows you what we really actually find. Here's Darwin's prediction. Morphologically, through time, you start out with a simple organism. That slowly, by natural selection, gives rise to all of these other major taxonomic groups. But at the top is what we actually find in the fossil record. These individual groups, or phyla, are indistinguishable. They are distinguishable in their groups, separated taxonomically from each other, and they appear with the more complex ones fossilized first, the top down, the exact opposite of what Darwin would have predicted. Okay, so here's some of those Cambrian organisms, which you look at the differences of them, they are bizarre. but very different. You've got sponges, sea lilies, brachiopods, trilobites, and they're all individual taxonomic groups that did not and were not evolved from any other types of organisms. If that doesn't show evidence of creation, I don't know what does. Okay, now, at this point, I'd like you to take a quick stretch break, and then we'll continue on with part 2. Now, part 2 is much shorter than part 1. We're going to take a quick break.
Perfect, time for a donut.
Stretch break. So if you would stand, please. And I promise not to go more than about 15 minutes more. Okay. So, but this section is very important. I want to quote some of Bill Nye's work, tell you what he says, and then show you and document precisely how he's wrong. Okay. So take a quick stretch break. Charlene, how long should we take? Or do you want to just stand and then sit right back down?
A couple minutes, so we gotta,
Yeah, who knew?
we have.
Couple of minutes?
Yes.
Okay. A lot of these claims. And Ken Ham, with his approach, didn't, unfortunately, answer a lot of the questions that Bill had in the debate. So some of us were very frustrated and wanted to give answers to those statements. And then also when Bill Nye wrote his book called Irrefutable, well, I'm sorry, that's a wrong title, but maybe you should change the title to Bill, You Are Refuted, or something like that. So his first example, let me show you what I'm talking about. In response to Bill Nye's allegations, example number 1, Bill Nye has stated there is no place, not one single example of a fossil from one layer trying to swim its way up into a more recent deposit. If there were a great flood and every living thing was drowning all at once, we would expect one of them somewhere to be caught trying to save its life. There is not one instance of this in any stratum anywhere on Earth. If you find one, you will turn science on its head. You will be famous. Believe me, people are looking. I find this statement absolutely and utterly untrue, wrong, and easily refuted. And I will give examples of just such a thing that Bill says is impossible. Well, the first thing is, of course, that organisms don't swim through strata. That's solid rock. Nothing can swim up through solid rock. So of course you wouldn't find a fossil swimming through rock. They don't swim through rock. They swim, in a flood through water. But we would be able to find some examples of organisms trying to flee such a flood. Do we find such cases? Yes, absolutely. An organism can't swim through strata composed of rock. However, organisms would try to flee the rising water by moving to higher ground. Prediction: there should be lots of footprints of organisms moving up the layers of sediments through the fossil record. Others trapped under layers of sediments might try to burrow through those layers, but they certainly wouldn't try to swim through them. We have many examples of footprints going up strata that is already underwater. We also have many burrows in the layers of strata. Let me document this. Okay, so here we see tracks in the sandstone in the Coconino Grand Canyon. Jeremy, you're very familiar with this, I'm sure. And for many years, it's been argued by the evolutionists that the Coconino sandstone was formed as sand dunes under air, that there really wasn't a water deposition of this particular layer in the Grand Canyon. However, notice what we see, these footprints, and one particular scientist has spent his entire career studying and publishing on these footprints. There's amphibian and reptile footprints found in the Coconino sandstone. You say, well, so what? Well, let me explain why that's important. So, for example, paleontologist Dr. Leonard Brand, and I've talked to Dr. Brand. He's been down there his whole career at Loma Linda University, a thorough organization down there, a very thorough school that has a great reputation. And Dr. Brand has spent his entire life studying these footprints in the Coconino. The Coconino sandstone in northern Arizona in the Grand Canyon shows numerous vertebrate fossil tracks formed in water, almost all moving uphill, up slope. Whoops, I guess you've made a mistake, Mr. Bill Nye, because there are out-of-sequence fossils, guy. Again, the current attempt to get out of the water. So they're going uphill, upslope, and Dr. Brand has documented that in hundreds of cases, these footprints are going away from where the water would be rising in the Coconino. The Coconino, as I've already stated, was thought to be an aeolian, that is a desert, sand dunes. Using live salamanders and newts over the course of several years, he was able to reproduce the tracks and trackways to show how that they were created. The trackways were confirmed to be subaqueous, formed underwater. Tracks start and stop suddenly. This wouldn't occur if they're in the desert. They got to come from someplace. But if they're in water, then these organisms would sink to the bottom, make some tracks, and rise back up. Or they would begin to flee those waters, and therefore the tracks would be truncated. In either case, the tracks would simply start in odd places and end in odd places, and that's exactly what you find. Tracks start and stop suddenly. The toes are pointed upward, again, evidence they're going uphill, and the currents move them specifically to the side. So they're walking along trying to get away from the water, and strong currents move them off to the side. And Dr. Brand was able to document this and reproduce the exact types of footprints that are found. This fits well with the concept of a global flood which overwhelmed these organizations. Brand published numerous articles in paleontology type publications to document this as the case. Strong evidence suggests a subaqueous deposition of the Coconino sandstone. So even evolutionists, Dr. Glenn Weiser, performed sand grain size analysis of the Coconino and showed that it's not a desert environment, but rather was formed underwater. Okay, so now what he did is he compared the types of grains that were found in the Coconino with sand grains that are found in deserts to verify that the sand grains in the Coconino had to be formed in an aqueous type of a circumstance. And of course, we believe the whole entire Grand Canyon was formed, deposited either during the flood or post-flood, and then eradicated by super erosion sometime either towards the end of the flood or sometime right after the flood. Okay, now, other additional evidence from Dr. John Whitmore in the Coconino, he showed that the angle of the dunes in the Coconino is far too small. In desert sand dunes, you get an angle of deposition of about 32 degrees. But in water deposited sediments formed in aqueous type of environments, the dunes have an angle about 20 degrees. So Whitmore spent the last 15 years studying the Coconino and verifying that the overwhelming evidence, he's got an article, I have the article here if anyone wants to see it, but we don't have enough time to go through these, that the overwhelming evidence documents that what we find is the water deposited sediments, the marine deposition of these sediments is not an aeolian type of environment. So he spent 15 years studying this, and he's got 6 precise examples of evidence from looking at the microscopic sand grains to show that this is water deposited. The Coconino, like all the other layers of the Grand Canyon, are water deposited, and we have an incredible case that erosion took place either at the end of the flood or right after the flood, and that there's not evidence of these footprints being deposited in an aeolian type of environment, supporting Brand's argument that we do find footprints of organisms fleeing massive flooding and trying to get away, just as what we would expect if there really was a flood. So, Mr. Bill Nye, you are wrong and you are refuted. Example number 2. Bill Nye has claimed that the layers of ice cores, one on top of another, show hundreds of thousands of annual layers for far too many for the Bible's short time scale. So the Bible, young Earth creationists argue that the Earth is perhaps some 6,000 to 10,000 years old, but he's got ice cores, and he says these ice cores go back 500,000 or more years, and therefore the Earth is much older than the Bible suggests, and therefore creationists are wrong. Well, it's he that is wrong. Let's find out why. In response to this point, multiple ice layers are known to occur in just one season. We've documented this. Ice layers are not necessarily annual. If you assume that each ice layer is the annual deposition, yeah, you can count tens or even hundreds of thousands of those. But Dr. Larry Vardaman, who is a PhD in atmospheric physics, has pointed out that during World War II, here's the absolute evidence that refutes Bill Nye, planes that were buried just 50 years ago, that was as of 1992, so that's add another, 20 years onto that. So about 70 years ago, in Greenland were already found to have 250 feet, so that'd have to be 250 years if each one of those layers represented an ice, a foot represented an ice layer, but actually it's several layers in each of those feet. Vardaman pointed out if the uniformitarian rates were to be consumed, less than 1,000 years would be required to form the entire Greenland ice sheet. So we have planes that were buried during World War II in the ice caps, and there's 250 feet. How did that represent, according to uniformitarianism, these hundreds of thousands of ice cores that are fossilized seasonally? It demonstrates that more than one layer is fossilized or laid down at one time. Okay, so it's absolute proof that that's the case. And Bill Nye, you are refuted. You were wrong on this point also. Okay, so here we see ice cores, and each layer is thought to be seasonal. They simply assume that that's the case, but we have documented evidence it's not the case. Why should we assume that? Oh, because evolution's a fact, and because the Earth is old. That's what an evolutionist will tell you. Wrong. There is good evidence this is not correct. Example number 3. Bill Nye has claimed that tree rings dating, called dendrochronology, has proven that the Earth is older than the Genesis chronology. Bill Nye, 2014, his book, Undeniable, according to him. Well, Bill Nye, I deny that you're undeniable. In response, multiple growth rings can occur in one season. Many growth rings can occur in 1 year. Climate changes can cause trees to produce more than one ring during the number of years they've been growing. Tree rings represent growth cycles, not growth years. We can document this. Read the article by Brian Thomas in Acts and Facts. He documents this. Yes?
It's also worth noting that a lot of the dendrochronology is done with bristlecone pines, and the evidence is a little bit picky there because the grain is extremely fine, and so fine that you can't study it with the naked eye. It's used with real powerful magnifiers. So, you think of a ring, you think of very pale wood and very dark wood. In bristlecone pines, the shade is much subtler than that.
Yeah.
Also, the bristlecone pines, as they presently are at high elevations where you have quite variable weather even during the growth season. So the growth season might be some modest number of weeks in a year.
You could get
the
more than
weather
one ring.
variability in there is quite a bit.
Yeah.
And the amount of increment you have in tree ring for the part of the tree that is growing rings at that moment, because it might not be the whole tree around. For that portion of the tree that is growing, the amount of growth we're talking about is extremely small. And those very tiny increments are being counted however they're counted.
As a year.
You can see where and you can see where the problem is in counting. Because they're kind of overstating it a bit to call those tree rings. They are subtler than the rings you see in the lumber yard.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's overwhelming evidence that you can get more than one ring in a year. In fact, multiple rings. And don't forget, at the end of the flood, there would be a massive ice age that oscillated back and forth. So you would get seasonal variations rapidly, and you might have 100 rings in 1 year based on those oscillations of the ice age. Okay, so here we see what tree rings look like. There's no question tree rings do exist, but the question is, what do they mean? You have to assume that each one of those rings represents a year, and then you document that back through time. But that is not the case. And dendrochronologists, the people that study tree rings, know this. but they assume that since evolution's a fact, oh, it must be. But the evidence is against it. Bill Nye, you are once again refuted. Okay, example number 4. Creationists, this was the one that really stuck in my craw. Creationists make no predictions. Bill Nye, undeniable, year 2014, last year when he published his book, page 5, says this: some of the most wonderful aspects and consequences of evolution have been discovered only recently. This is in stark contrast to creationism, which offers a static view of the world, ones that cannot be challenged or tested with reason. And because it cannot make predictions, that's creation, it cannot lead to new discoveries, new medicines, or new ways to feed all of us. Wrong.
Wow.
Let me give some examples where the thing that Bill Nye did is he did not study any of the creation literature. And by the way, he has no references in his book to where he gets these ideas. So he didn't even bother to look at the last 30 or 40 years of research that creationists have done and documented. A list of many of the successful creation predictions could be listed. I could do a whole presentation just on this, but I'll only give a few examples to show you that such the case that Bill Nye is wrong. Dr. Russell Humphreys correctly predicted that the planet Uranus and Neptune would be found to have a magnetic field. He did this before those magnetic fields were discovered. He published on this in an impact article in Acts and Facts in 1990 and also in the Creation Research Society Quarterly in 1984. And I have those articles to document this is so. He made those predictions before we discovered that these particular planets do have magnetic fields. So that's prediction number 1. It is proven wrong. So Bill Nye is already wrong just in one case. Creationists anticipated, predicted that many dozens of alleged vestigial organs that have thought to have no function, organs would be shown to have a function. My good friend, again, Dr. George Howe and Dr. Jerry Bergman, who is a brilliant PhD biologist, published a book back in 1990 where they made that prediction. Now, almost all the organs that we've studied show that they have a function. For a while, we thought that the appendix or the tonsils didn't have a function back in the 1960s. We now know that the appendix is essential for fighting disease, particularly in children, and so are the tonsils. Again, Bill Nye, you are absolutely refuted. Creationists do make predictions, and they do good science. Example number 4. Creationists have predicted that the so-called junk DNA, that parts of DNA that don't have a function in making proteins, do have a function. Dr. Jonathan Wells, in his book in 2011, The Myth of Junk DNA. In other words, there is a function for this DNA. In this case, DNA that does not code for proteins was thought by the evolutionists, of course, since it evolved through time, to be junk. Up to that date, evidence showed that much of our non-protein coding DNA performs essential biological functions. For example, starting of certain proteins, ending of certain proteins, and other functional types of operations. Example number 4, Dr. Matthew Murray, the father of oceanography, who made extensive hydrological surveys of winds and of the ocean currents of the Atlantic Ocean. He discovered the cause and effect relationship between air circulation and systems on the Earth and the great ocean currents, and he was able to chart most of those. Why? Because he believed what the Bible said. Okay, now you understand, of course, the Psalms were written thousands of years ago. As a Bible-believing Christian, he had received the conviction that such relationship existed and that such paths could be discovered from such scriptures as the following: the fowl of the air and the fish of the sea, and whatsoever path is through the paths of the sea. He knew there were paths in the sea, and so he discovered, based on that, written thousands of years ago, Mr. Bill Nye, prediction that indeed there is paths in the sea, which he discovered and founded the discipline of oceanography on. Okay, now we don't have time to read this, but Dr. Stephen Mayer, in his book, Signature in the Cell, here are all in yellow. I can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 predictions for the future that creation scientists made, many of which have come true. I don't have time to go into these, but documented thoroughly in his book page 496 and 497 of Signature in the Cell. This one example, Mr. Bill Nye, science guy, you are wrong, and you are Mr. Refuted guy, because Stephen Mayer made over 11 predictions just in his book, One Creationist Alone. By the way, this was written and published in 2011, before you said there were no predictions. Wrong, Mr. Bill Nye. Example number 5, Bill Nye has claimed the second law of thermodynamics, and I'm going to stop with this one because I've gone too far, but there is more, just so you know. This is the last example. Bill Nye claimed that the second law of thermodynamics does not contradict evolution. He did that in his book, Undeniable, page 21. He stated, here's the most important thing to know. The second law of thermodynamics applies only to closed systems, like a cylinder in a car engine, and Earth is not even remotely a closed system. Transfer of matter and energy are constantly taking place. Life here is nothing like a perpetual motion machine. Well, I agree with him on that. But neither is like a ball rolling inexorably downhill. So in other words, the second law, which creationists, that's easily refuted, because you see we have the sun, and it's an open system, and the sun gives us all the energy we need. Wrong. You lay out on the beach for about 3 days, and you will be the tannest corpse out there. You cannot convert that energy, because what you need, it is true, it is a necessary part of the formula. It's necessary to have an open system. The energy has to pour in. However, you must have, from the beginning, an energy conversion system, a blueprint, and a plan to convert that energy. Again, Bill Nye is wrong in this case. Yes?
If that is truly what he said,
Well, I'm quoting directly.
not only is he wrong there, he is confusing the second and first laws of thermodynamics. It's the first law of thermodynamics that applies to a closed system, and the second law of thermodynamics says that randomness is always increasing.
Entropy.
So his
Well,
rationale
again,
is wrong
yeah.
on
Keep in
multiple
mind,
levels.
Bill Nye has no science degrees. He has a bachelor's degree in engineering. He's not, doesn't have a degree in physics, chemistry, geology, biology, any of the hard sciences that would deal with evolution at all. And so he merely parrots what he's heard. I heard the greatest paleontologist in the 20th century say, well, in his book, I should say, Dr. Stephen Jay Gould, the same exact thing. It's absolutely been refuted by creationists for more than 40 years. Jeremy, you and I have been in this thing for 30 years or so. Am I not correct on that? This has been refuted by Dr. Henry Morris in his writings back in the 1970s and the 1980s. The same with Dr. Dwayne Gish in hundreds of debates. It's like, excuse me, you're wrong, because an open system is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. You must have a blueprint, a plan, and an energy conversion system. Evolution has none of those things. Photosynthesis, which cannot be explained by evolution, is already in place, a complex design system, and that refutes that. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm sorry because we ran out of time. There's more to the presentation, but we're going to end here.
Thank you.
Charlene?
Thank you.
And we'll take some questions.
We need to do the drawing.
Okay. Let me get out of the way
So
here.
Ed's going to do a random